Imagine waking on a frosty morning, pulling yourself upright, reaching for the jug of water at the bedside, and finding the water frozen. Not out in the yard, but right inside the house, 2 steps from where you slept. It seems impossible. For a medieval peasant, it was an ordinary winter reality. Let's step back to when winter wasn't for skiing or snowmen, but a grueling ordeal that demanded every scrap of folk wisdom and ingenuity. I'm Daniel Hayes, and this is Lectures Under the Moon: How Ordinary People Faced Extraordinary Cold. Start with the climate. Medieval winters and ours were very different beasts. Today, when we grumble at a wind chill of -15 and crank up the heating, we do not face what our ancestors did. What they encountered is what scientists call the Little Ice Age. It began roughly in the 15th century and stretched all the way into the 19th century. Average temperatures fell by about 1 to 2 degrees Celsius. That number seems small until you grasp what it meant for weather and people. It is like your own body temperature rising by 2 degrees. Suddenly, everything feels wrong. What followed in practice was startling. Rivers that had never frozen solid iced over so thoroughly that people drove sleighs across them and set up markets on the ice. The famous Rhine in 1365 froze through, and resourceful merchants opened an entire bazaar on that frozen river. The Thames in London froze so solid that the English staged great frost fairs on the ice, with roasted bulls and carousels set up on the frozen water. Picture yourself walking across the river like any other road, while fish beneath the ice look up at you in astonishment. On one hand, it was spectacle. On the other, it proved how much harsher winters had become. These weren't mere curiosities in chroniclers' accounts. Winters grew longer and more merciless. Snow could lie from October to May. 1-meter drifts were the norm rather than the exception. Frosts descended to bitter extremes. All of this happened while peasant cottages, simple wooden huts, were drafty and thin against the cold. Medieval chronicles tell of arduous winter journeys when travelers had to seek shelter in the nearest village, and of nights so severe that people had to bring their livestock into living spaces to protect them from the frost. The climatic trial reached a peak in the catastrophe known as the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317. For 3 years in a row, summers were cold and rain-soaked. Crops rotted in the fields. Winters were so savage that stores ran critically short. People ate bark and grass and anything else that could provide a scrap of calories. It was one of the bleakest periods for all of Northern Europe, and hunger itself made resisting the cold far harder. An emaciated body cannot hold warmth. Starvation and winter joined to form a vicious, compounding threat. Because of that, winter demanded real respect. To survive the winter meant making it to spring with enough food and heat. Every autumn, families began active preparations, stacking firewood, repairing roofs, and insulating walls. Winter required prudence, memory, and a knowledge of every trick of survival. And society was brutally unequal in access to warmth. Wealthy feudal lords in stone castles enjoyed vast hearths, tapestries on their walls for insulation, fur mantles, and warm sleeping chambers. Peasants, who made up about 80 to 90% of the population, huddled in modest huts. They had no glass windows, no large stoves, and not nearly enough warm clothing. The contrast was stark. Nobles could even complain of stuffiness in their bedrooms, while outside the castle walls, peasants shivered in their hovels. A small telling detail lives in some medieval texts. Monks recorded that ink would freeze in inkwells while they were writing. Even in monastery rooms, warmed by a meager stove, the cold crept in and interrupted their work. And now imagine what it was like for an ordinary peasant who had no monastery walls, no constant hearth, no warm cassock. At least the monks could complain in their chronicles. Peasants were illiterate, but wildly inventive in ways to keep warm. So how did they survive? How did they manage to stay warm on long winter nights when the temperature outside, and indeed inside the house, fell below zero? The secret was not a single magic trick, but an entire system of contrivances, folk wisdom, and astonishing resourcefulness. It was a combination of the right dwelling, smart use of fire, mutual aid between people and animals, special clothing and bedding. Remarkably, many of these methods still work and can be useful even to a modern person. But before describing how they kept the interior warm, we must understand what a medieval peasant hut actually looked like, and why it was at once a refuge and a continual challenge for its inhabitants. The walls of the house were the first line of defense against winter cold, modest though they were by our standards. In autumn, when leaves began to yellow and nights grew cooler, every peasant family set about preparing for the long winter ahead. Winter advanced inexorably, and the hut had to be turned into the warmest shelter possible. It's striking that many peasant solutions, despite lacking scientific terms, were practical and rooted in an intuitive grasp of how heat works. Principles of insulation, heat retention, and the creation of air pockets were applied across generations of experience and observation. Next, we'll look at the typical peasant house and the architectural tricks that kept heat inside. For now, picture a typical peasant hut of the 15th century, somewhere in northern Europe. Forget the storybook cottages with carved shutters and tiled roofs. Those were the privilege of townspeople and prosperous craftsmen. The ordinary peasant lived in a building that by modern standards resembled a shed more than a home. Size was modest. Most often a single room measured about 5 by 3 meters, at most 6 by 4 meters if they were lucky. The whole family, parents, children, sometimes grandparents, crowded into that tiny space. Large families were the norm. 5 to 7 people in such a box was common. That very closeness would later prove important for keeping warm, but more on that later. Building materials depended on the locality, yet the guiding principle was the same. Use what was at hand and cost nothing. In wooded areas, the frame was timber, daubed with clay mixed with straw. That is, wattle and daub, often called wattle and daub. The technique is brilliant in its simplicity. Craftsmen wove walls from rods like a giant basket, then smeared a mixture of clay, dung, and chopped straw over the weave. It sounds unglamorous, but the dung acted as a binder and added insulating properties. After drying, the result was a reasonably sturdy wall with a thickness of about 20 to 30 centimeters. Those walls had one indisputable advantage. They retained heat far better than plain wooden planks. Clay is an excellent insulator. It warms slowly and cools slowly. The straw in the mix created air pockets, and air, as everyone who has ever built a thatch knows, is one of the best insulators. Medieval peasants did not know physics by name, but through trial and error, they learned that the thicker the wall and the more straw it contained, the warmer the house in winter. Of course, there was a downside. Such walls feared moisture and demanded regular maintenance. Every autumn, the cracks had to be replastered with fresh clay, otherwise the wind would whistle through them in winter. In colder regions, especially in Scandinavia and in Rus, people built log houses. Massive logs were stacked into a frame, and the gaps were caulked with moss.
Moss is an astonishing material. It not only filled the gaps, but had antiseptic properties too, helping to keep the timbers from rotting.
Hygroscopic by nature, it absorbed moisture when the air was wet and released it when the air dried, quietly regulating the microclimate inside the house. Our ancestors quite literally packed every crack with this natural insulating material, and just before winter, they would go over the walls again with a fresh handful of moss, stopping up every place a draft might find. Now the roof, that is another story. Most peasant houses were roofed with straw or reeds. A straw roof 30 to 40 centimeters thick is, mind you, an extraordinary thermal insulator. The air trapped between the stalks works like a blanket spread over the whole house. In winter, such a roof keeps the warmth inside. In summer, it prevents the heat from seeping in. The trouble was obvious and serious. Straw catches fire easily. One stray spark, a gust of wind, and the house was gone. So peasants tried to protect thatch with a coating of clay or with turf, though even that did not always save them. Windows are a special subject, or rather, their absence. Glass in the Middle Ages was an incredible luxury, available only to the very wealthy. The ordinary peasant could only dream of a glazed window, so huts had small holes cut in the walls that in winter were sealed up tight with whatever came to hand. Rags, moss, straw, even sacks stuffed with hay. Some households stretched a bull's bladder or oiled cloth over the opening. That let a little light through, but it was still dim inside. In winter, the choice was simple: light or heat. Peasants chose heat, plunging their homes into twilight for months at a time. An interesting detail: in many regions, houses were built partly into the ground, so-called semi-subterranean dwellings. The floor lay 0.5 meter to 1 meter below the surrounding ground level. Why? Because soil at depth holds a relatively stable temperature year-round, about 8 to 10 degrees Celsius. That means in winter, the earth is warmer than the air, and in summer, it is cooler. By sinking the house, people used the ground itself as a natural thermostat. The low profile also kept the worst of the wind at bay. Gusts simply passed over the shallow roof. The downside, of course, was increased dampness and humidity inside, another problem entirely. One particularly clever solution appears in the longhouses of Scandinavia and some other regions. Under a single roof lived both people and their animals, sometimes separated only by a low partition or an imagined line. Picture it. On one side, people slept. On the other, a cow, a horse, goats, and sheep. It sounds unhygienic by modern standards, but from the point of view of conserving heat, it was brilliant. Animals give off an enormous amount of warmth. One cow produces roughly as much heat as 3 to 4 grown humans. It is like a free stove burning all night. Of course, such proximity brought side effects: a pervasive smell, higher humidity from the animal's breathing and waste, and a greater risk of parasites. But when the temperature outside is minus 25 degrees Celsius and the alternative is freezing, concerns about cleanliness take a back seat. Besides, people were accustomed to this arrangement from childhood and saw nothing odd about it. In fact, many believed that the warmth and the cow's breath were good for the health of small children. As winter approached, the house was prepared in a careful ritual that determined how bearable the cold months would be. First, the roof was inspected. Any holes noted, any rotten thatch pulled away, and a fresh layer added where needed. The walls were checked, and every crack sealed with fresh clay. Special attention was paid to the floor. Often made of tamped earth, it was covered before winter with a thick layer of straw or reeds. That created additional insulation from the cold ground beneath. Windows, as we have said, was stuffed with particular care. Some peasants even wrapped the outside of the house in an extra layer of straw or brushwood, creating a dead airspace that improved insulation. Others banked up ridges of earth or manure against the walls. Those too served as extra insulation and a windbreak. These were not crude improvisations, but deliberate, time-tested measures, small, practical acts that together made the difference between a tolerable winter and a deadly one. The most far-sighted among them also built vast reserves of wood, peat, or dried dung for fuel. Without fuel, even the best insulated hut became an icy vault. Yet there is a paradox. You could insulate the walls perfectly, stuff every crack, sink the house partly into the earth, even keep a cow beside the living space, and still warmth was not guaranteed. The principal source of heat in a medieval hut was not the building itself, but what sat at its center, the thing around which the family's whole life was organized. It gave not only heat, but also light and the means to cook. It demanded constant attention and care, and in return, it offered a chance to survive the winter night. Of course, I mean the fire, the heart of the home, the dwelling's soul, the last hope against the biting cold. Step into a medieval hut on a frosty evening. The first thing you notice in the half-dark is the reddish glow in the center of the single room. The open hearth, lined with stones in the middle of an earthen or wooden floor, was far more than a place to cook. It was the absolute focus of family life, the alpha and omega of peasant existence. People gathered around it to eat, to talk, to warm themselves, and to sleep. They cooked there, dried clothing there, mended tools by the light of embers. The hearth provided warmth, light, and the possibility of survival. Without it, the hut was simply a wooden coffin. The construction of such a hearth was surprisingly simple, yet in that simplicity lay centuries of hard-earned knowledge. In the middle of the room, away from easily ignitable walls, a patch of earth was cleared and ringed with stones. The stones served several purposes at once. They kept embers and ash from scattering through the house and protected the wooden floor from catching. Most interestingly, they acted as crude but effective radiators. Stone has a remarkable property that modern engineers call thermal mass. In plain terms, stone heats slowly and cools slowly. Imagine a day in which the fire burns steadily. The stones become red hot. By evening, when the flames die down, those stones continue to give off heat for about 12 hours, sometimes longer. They are a natural heating battery that keeps giving warmth through the night without a recharge. Practical peasants chose especially dense rocks for hearthstones: granite, sandstone, limestone, anything that could store more heat. At times, they deliberately brought large boulders and placed them near the fire to serve as additional heaters. The most enterprising even heated stones in the hearth, wrapped them in rags, and laid them at the foot of the bed, a practice we will return to. Now fuel. It was almost a science. In wooded regions, people burned firewood, oak, birch, ash, whatever was available. But firewood had to be felled and dried, a chore that took time and labor. Moreover, the right to collect dead wood in the forest was not always free. Many woods belonged to the local lord, and poaching could be punished. As a result, poor peasants often burned whatever was free and at hand. Peat cut from the bogs and left to dry, dried grasses, reeds, and, in treeless steppe areas, dried dung. Yes, cow or sheep pats dried in the sun were perfectly respectable fuel. They burn slowly and give off a decent heat, though with a peculiar scent to which people quickly acclimatized. And here the most interesting part of our story begins: the smoke. In most peasant huts there was no chimney.
You did not mishear me.
A pipe to carry smoke outside simply did not exist. Smoke from the hearth rose to the ceiling, pooled beneath the thatch, and slowly seeped out through gaps in the roof, a deliberate hole in the ridge, or the open doorway. Such dwellings were called black huts, or smoke-filled huts. They were black inside from soot. The upper portion of the room, up to about halfway, was glazed with shiny black soot. Living in that smoke was, to put it mildly, uncomfortable. Eyes watered, throats became raw, and clothing became saturated with the smell of smoke through and through. This smoke was the price of a hearth that kept a family warm through long, cold nights. The trade-offs, warmth versus light, smoke versus air, survival versus comfort, were the everyday arithmetic of peasant life. It shaped how houses were built, how fuel was chosen and stored, and how people spent their evenings crouched close to that red glow, tending the embers that were their lifeline. Daniel Hayes for Lectures Under the Moon. Cold winters were the worst. You could not open the door to air the room without letting out all the precious warm air. Open it, and the heat vanished. You had to choose: freeze in fresh air or breathe smoke in warmth. The peasants chose the smoke. They even developed the habit of sitting and sleeping low, right at floor level, where the smoke thinned and the air was cleaner. Smoke rises, leaving below it a relatively clean zone. That was where they lived. Strangely, this nightmare of a system had its advantages. As the smoke rose through a straw roof, it soaked the thatch with resins, and in effect preserved it, making it more resistant to rot. The same smoke drove insects and rodents away from the loft. The soot on the walls and ceiling built up into an extra insulating layer. Nature hates waste, and the medieval peasant hated waste even more. If smoke was unavoidable, it might as well do some good. Chimneys and stone stoves did exist, of course, but they were luxury. At first, they appeared in castles and in the houses of wealthy townspeople, and only by the 10th to 12th centuries did they gradually spread among prosperous peasants. The ordinary poor could only dream of a whitewashed cottage with a proper oven. Return now to the hearth and its one great task: to give heat through the whole night. Here a serious problem arose. Fire is voracious. It eats wood quickly. If you simply left a blaze burning through the night, by morning it would either have consumed all the fuel, or it would have died long before dawn. Relighting a cold hearth from scratch was tedious and slow. You needed tinder, skill, patience, and practice. So medieval peasants invented a clever trick called banking the embers, or hiding the fire. In the evening, before bed, when the logs had burned down to embers, the mistress of the house took an iron shovel and carefully scraped all the hot embers into a single heap in the center of the hearth. She then generously covered that heap with a layer of ash a few centimeters thick. Ash is a remarkable material. It does not burn, and it is an excellent insulator. Under the ash, the embers continued to smolder extremely slowly, with almost no access to oxygen. Temperature dropped. The rate of combustion slowed by tens of times. Yet the fire did not die. It seemed to fall asleep with the household. In the morning, all that was needed was to rake away the ash, blow on the glowing embers, add a little dry straw or a splinter of wood, and the fire burst into life again. No agonizing with tinder, no waste of time. With proper skill, embers banked under ash could smolder for 12 hours or longer. Some particularly skillful housewives bragged that they could keep a fire alive for several days in this way, simply adding fuel from time to time and recovering it with ash. In certain regions of Europe, There was even a tradition of keeping the hearth fire alive all year long, from one festival to the next. A new fire was ceremonially kindled, for example, at Samhain or at Christmas, and then guarded until the following year. The belief ran that while the household fire burned, evil could not enter the home. The family would be safe. A hearth that had gone out meant misfortune, death, an end. So the fire was watched relentlessly, as if it were a treasure. On the coldest nights, banking the embers was not enough. Families organized actual watches at the hearth. They took turns rising in the night to add wood and sustain the flame. It was like a guard duty. Sleep for 2 or 3 hours, then rise, stir the embers, add a log, and lie down again. This was especially true during the fiercest frosts, when the indoor temperature without a fire could fall to dangerous levels. Older children and adult men kept this watch in rotation, and the mistress of the house usually rose last before dawn to blow the fire into full life and prepare the morning meal. Yet an open fire in a wooden house was always a dangerous gamble. One stray spark, one gust of wind, one careless movement, and everything could flare. Fires were the curse of medieval villages. Whole streets burned down to cinders. For that reason, some towns even passed special laws to try to prevent such disasters. At a certain hour in the evening, the church bell would ring, a reminder to cover the fire. It was called the curfew, or, in French, curfew, literally, close the fire. At that signal, every household had to either place a special metal lid over the hearth or smother the embers with ash. The point was simple: reduce the risk of a night fire. Even so, danger remained a constant companion to warmth. Peasants lived on a knife edge. Too little fire and you froze. Too much and you burned. Wind made the gamble worse, scattering sparks in all directions. Someone was always watching that the straw on the floor did not ignite, that a child's drying clothes by the hearth did not flare up, that a dog or a cat would not knock over a pot of embers. Life around an open fire demanded vigilance every minute. And this brings us to another problem with the open hearth. Its heat spread very unevenly. If you sat right at the fire, you were hot on one side and cold on the other. In the far corners of the hut, 2 to 3 meters away, the air was only a little warmer than outside. The blaze warmed only the immediate circle around it, a radius of 1.5 meters or so. Beyond that, the heat dissipated quickly, especially when drafts blew through cracks in the walls. The result was a paradox. At the hearth you might sit in a single shirt, while against the wall you shivered even in a sheepskin coat. At night, when the embers were banked with ash and the fire gave hardly any heat, the whole hut cooled fast. Stones would hold warmth for a while, but they too cooled in time. By morning, the house might be little warmer than the world outside. So merely having a hearth was not enough for a comfortable night. Additional sources of heat were needed, ideally right next to the body. Here, the oldest, most reliable, and most accessible heating system nature had provided long before humans arrived came into play: the warmth of living creatures, people and animals. Every warm-blooded being is a small stove, constantly producing heat, and medieval peasants learned to use that resource with ruthless efficiency, turning bodies into true thermal islands by intertwining human and animal forms. Picture an evening in a medieval hut. The sun has set, the day's work is finished, the family has eaten by the hearth, and it is time for bed. Where do all these people go? Parents, 4 or 5 children, perhaps a grandmother or grandfather, each to separate beds in separate rooms? Far from it. They all gather at a single bed, placed against the far wall, as far from drafts as possible, but close enough to catch the hearth's last warmth. And now, the real game begins. How to fit 6 to 8 people on one mattress so that everyone is warm and at least marginally comfortable. Sleeping together on one bed was the absolute norm in the medieval household. This was not the preserve of the poor alone. Even noble families practiced it, though their beds were at least larger. Our modern ideas of personal space and privacy simply did not exist. Sleeping alone was regarded as strange, unnatural, even dangerous. In sleep, a person is defenseless. There was safety in numbers, someone to wake or to fend off a threat. Besides, a separate bed was a luxury only a few could afford. Peasants had one bed for everyone, period. There was, however, an order to the arrangement, almost a ritual. In Irish families, for example, the parents, husband and wife, lay in the center of the bed. Daughters were placed to the mother's side, sons to the father's. Children were arranged by age, the youngest pressed closest to the parents, the older ones nearer the edges. The smallest girl slept at her mother's side, the smallest boy at his father's. The logic was practical and plain. Little children lose heat faster and need more warmth, so they were buried in the middle, in the very warmest place. The English even had a special verb for it, to pig together. Literally, to pig together, like piglets heaped in a pile. Watch a litter of piglets sleeping and you will see why. All of them jammed tight against one another, pressed warm and snug. It is the perfect image for a medieval family on a shared bed. There was no sense of privacy, no talk of needing personal space. Everyone simply sprawled where they could, piled up as circumstances allowed. It is telling that even aristocrats did not shy away from communal sleeping. King Richard the Lionheart and the French king, Philip II, to seal their friendship and alliance, slept in the same bed. That was a normal, visible way to show trust and intimacy. But why did it work as a method of warming? The answer is simple physics, something our forebears grasped by instinct without degrees or texts. Each human body is a little stove running on the fuel of eaten food. We, warm-blooded creatures, are constantly generating heat through metabolism. Approximately 75% of the energy from food becomes heat rather than useful work. Normal human body temperature is about 36.5 to 37 degrees Celsius. That means even a sleeping person is radiating warmth. When several people lie close together, they create what modern scientists call a thermal island. Each body warms its neighbors. The air trapped between bodies heats up and is then held in place by blankets and skins thrown over the group. The result is a kind of heat cocoon, where the temperature inside is a few degrees higher than in the rest of the hut. The more bodies, the warmer it gets. 8 people under a single blanket can give off as much heat as a decent stove. No wonder peasants could sleep relatively comfortably even when the hut was below freezing. There were other practical advantages to this arrangement as well. Children sleeping between or beside adults were kept under constant protection. If an infant kicked off covers in the night, a parent felt it and pulled the blanket back. If a child fell ill, adults would notice at once. Physical contact soothed and conferred a sense of safety. In a dark hut where the winter wind howled through the gaps, where cooling logs cracked and every sound turned sinister, the warmth of a familiar body was priceless. Family, however, was not the only company in a medieval bed. A guest, a wandering monk, a peddler, or simply a traveler caught out by the night would be invited into the communal lying place. Yes, a perfect stranger might sleep in a heap with your family. Hospitality made that ordinary. Taverns and inns rarely had private rooms. Travelers simply lay down on large, shared beds, sometimes with 6 to 8 people who had never met before. Imagine lying between a merchant from Flanders and a pilgrim from Scotland, as each snores in a different key. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to Lectures Under the Moon. This method of sleeping had downsides. You never knew how hygienic your bedfellow might be, whether they snored, turned restlessly, or carried disease. Illness spread like wildfire. If one person fell sick, the rest of the household would often be in bed within days. Lice and fleas moved from body to body with the delighted curiosity of explorers discovering new lands. But choices were limited. Freeze alone, or suffer the discomfort of overcrowding and sleep warm. People of the Middle Ages chose warmth. Now add another category of sleeping companions: animals. Here the story becomes even more interesting. Dogs and cats did not sleep in a corner of the room. They slept on the bed, among the people, or at their feet. This was not mere indulgence or sentiment. It was practical calculation. A dog's body temperature is about 38.5 to 39 degrees Celsius. A cat's is even higher, around 38 to 39.5 degrees Celsius. That makes them about 1 to 2 degrees warmer than a human. Hold a large dog close, and you have an additional heater working through the whole night. Cats were prized for their warmth and compactness. A fluffy cat curled on your stomach or at your feet is an excellent radiator for the extremities that freeze first. As Daniel Hayes of Lectures Under the Moon often observes, the medieval bed was not simply a place to sleep. It was a carefully managed microclimate, a cooperative strategy of bodies, blankets, hides, and animals forged by necessity against a cold world. Cats hunted the mice that were forever trying to gnaw through the grain stores. Dogs performed a double duty too. They warmed bodies and stood watch, barking if a stranger came near the house. The arrangement became an almost perfect symbiosis. Animals drew heat from people and, plainly, blood. People received heat from animals and their services. If cats and dogs were relatively compact, tidy companions, the real heat factories were those long houses where people and large livestock lived under one roof. Cow, horse, goats, sheep, all of them gave their warmth to the household, even if only through a partition. One adult cow, weighing about 400 to 500 kilograms, emits roughly as much heat per hour as 3 to 4 adult humans. That is on the order of 300 to 400 watts of steady power. A cow's body temperature is around 38.5 to 39 degrees Celsius. A few cows in the adjacent stall could raise the temperature of the whole dwelling by several degrees. Sheep and goats, though smaller, also made a real contribution. A flock of 10 sheep in a byre attached to the living quarters produced as much heat as a pair of grown people. Because sheep are woolly, they hold that warmth well and release it slowly. A horse, with a body temperature around 37.5 to 38 degrees Celsius and a large mass, functioned like a living heater on a scale that put most other sources to shame. Of course, this proximity had costs. The smell of dung and the ammonia rising from urine, especially where the barn was poorly cleaned, permeated the living area. Animal resting increased indoor humidity, encouraging mold on the walls. Pests, ticks, fleas, lice, gladly migrated from animals to humans. Diseases could cross the species barrier in both directions. But when it was minus 25 degrees Celsius outside, and the alternative was freezing to death, questions of hygiene slid far down the list of priorities. In some particularly cold regions, for example in mountain districts or on the far northern fringes, people adopted still more extreme tactics. Shepherds caught in foul weather far from home would sometimes sleep right among their sheep or goats, burrowing between warm bodies. If a traveler had a dog, he pressed it to his chest and tucked it beneath his clothing, creating a shared thermal envelope. They called it sleeping like a dog, and it literally saved lives. Thus, the medieval bedroom turned into something like a menagerie. Parents, children, grandparents, guests, dogs, cats, and beyond the wall, cows, goats, horses, sheep, and chickens on their perches, all together, cramped but not resentful, forming a single thermal bubble in which a harsh winter night could be survived. It was an ecosystem of survival, where everyone performed a function. Someone kept the fire going, someone contributed body heat, someone kept watch, someone simply took up space and added bulk. Even that close communal sleeping and cohabitation with animals was not always enough, especially during the fiercest freezes. Additional protection was needed, something that put a buffer between the body and the cold air, something that trapped precious heat and kept it from dissipating into the icy interior of the hut. That was where clothing, bedding, and a whole arsenal of ingenious warming implements, which peasants had developed over centuries of battling cold, came into play. Friends, a small request. Support Lectures Under the Moon with a like. It helps the channel grow. We lay down, the family pressed together. Dogs snuffled nearby. A cow lowed in the next room. In the hearth, dull coals glowed under a covering of ash. It could have been enough for a calm night's sleep, but medieval peasants knew better. A bare body under a single blanket was a sure invitation to wake with blue lips and chattering teeth. What was required was extra armor against cold, a whole system of protective layers that turned a person into something like a cabbage head, layer upon layer, insulation upon insulation. Begin with the most surprising fact to modern ears. Medieval peasants slept in their clothes. This was not negligence or forgetfulness, it was deliberate strategy. Undressing naked for bed was a luxury, one permitted only to the very wealthy, and only in very warm bedrooms. An ordinary peasant went to bed at the very least wearing a next-to-skin shirt made of coarse linen or hemp, and on especially cold nights, he slept in the very same clothes he had worn by day. A woolen tunic, trousers, several layers piled one on top of the other. There was an iron logic to it. Each layer of fabric traps a layer of air, and air is the best of insulators. The linen undergarment soaked up sweat and protected the skin. Over that, woolen garments held the body heat. Wool is a remarkable material. Even when damp, it continues to warm. Sheep's wool contains lanolin, a natural grease that repels water and preserves its insulating qualities. That is why woolen garments formed the backbone of winter wardrobes. Those who could afford it slept in wool tunics and even cloaks, wrapped from head to toe. Now, a separate song about nightcaps. You may think this is a quaint detail from old Christmas cards, grandfathers in striped caps. Far from it. A nightcap was an utterly practical, life-saving invention. A person loses up to 30% of body heat through the head. The head, with its rich blood supply, is like an open tap through which precious heat runs away. Thus, the nightcap was not a whim, but a necessity. Medieval nightcaps were made of wool or linen. Often they were closely lined, fit snugly over the head, covered the ears, and were sometimes tied under the chin so they would not slip off in sleep. Women wore coifs similar to those they wore by day, linen or wool caps that completely hid the hair. That was both practical and in keeping with notions of modesty. A married woman was not supposed to show her hair even at night. Men contented themselves with simple caps, sometimes finished with a playful pom-pom at the tip. Curiously, in some monasteries, nightcaps were not issued to all monks, but only to those who perspired heavily in their sleep, so that their sweat would not spoil the pillow. This was regarded as an exceptional privilege. By the 10th century, caps had become commonplace for everyone. Documents from that time mention that housewives were obliged to provide nightcaps to guests staying overnight, an act of hospitality. Now the feet, another weak point in the struggle against cold. Feet grow cold first, and cold feet will prevent sleep even when the rest of the body is warm. Therefore, peasants slept in woolen socks or wrapped their feet with strips of woolen cloth, the simple foot wrappings familiar to travelers. Some did not even take off their daytime shoes or boots at night, especially travelers in taverns who did not trust their bedfellows. Let us turn to the bed, or rather, to what they slept on and under. A mattress, in our sense, was a luxury. Peasants had a tick, a coarse sack of thick canvas stuffed with straw, hay, dry leaves, moss, and, in the best cases, sheep's wool. Straw is an excellent choice for insulation. It creates air pockets and lifts the sleeper above the cold floor or wooden planks. The problem was that straw quickly settled, turning into a stiff, lumpy mass. That is why it was regularly renewed, typically restuffed in autumn before winter. The better off could afford ticks filled with wool, down, or feathers. These were far more comfortable and warmer, but also far more costly. Bed linens were such valuables that blankets and sheets were passed down as heirlooms and listed in wills. Imagine reading a will that says, "I bequeath to my eldest son a cow and a woolen blanket." To us that sounds odd, but for a medieval person, a good warm blanket was worth a fortune. Coverings varied with means. The poorest covered themselves with whatever was at hand: old clothing, sacks, hides, coarse woolen cloth. Sheepskins or goatskins were popular. Fur turned inward against the body, leather outward. It made for warmth and relative ease. Those who could afford it had woolen blankets, heavy, thick, coarse, but unbelievably warm. The weight of such a blanket could reach several kilograms. Under one of those, you would not freeze even in bitter frost. Daniel Hayes, for Lectures Under the Moon. And now for the most interesting part: medieval bed warmers and ways to heat the bed. This is where real popular ingenuity shows itself. The simplest, most accessible trick was to take a stone the size of a brick, or an actual brick, lay it in the hearth, heat it until it glowed, and then, with tongs or a shovel, remove it carefully. The stone would be wrapped in several layers of rags, or shoved into an old sack and placed in the bed at the feet. A stone heated to a high temperature could hold heat for 6 to 8 hours. That was usually enough to get through the first half of the night, the coldest part. Warm feet spread comfort up the body, and falling asleep became far easier. By morning, the stone had cooled, but by then the daylight was coming, and the air outside would be a little warmer. Some particularly prudent peasants heated several stones at once and positioned them in different parts of the bed, one at the feet, another by the small of the back. Another popular option was pig bladders filled with hot water, the great-grandmother of the modern rubber hot water bottle. After careful cleaning and treatment, a pig bladder became surprisingly sturdy and watertight. Boiling water was poured in. The opening was tightly tied. The bladder was wrapped in cloth and tucked into the bed. Water loses heat more slowly than air, so such a warmer could work for several hours straight. The danger, of course, was that the bladder might burst and soak the bed,
a disaster in an already cold house, so people handled these contraptions with great care. Those who could afford it had real copper or iron bed warmers, flat pans with long handles and lids into which hot coals from the hearth were placed. These warmers were slid between the sheets and run methodically over the bed before sleep, like a primitive iron. Imagine a servant or the housekeeper taking that pan and passing it across the whole mattress. The bed would become warm and snug, inviting to climb into. Archaeologists have even found one of these warmers with an engraving that reads, "Sweet dreams, may the lice not bite." Apparently, medieval people kept their humor, even in matters of survival. The most enterprising went further and created a rotation system for bed warmers. One historical document mentions a nobleman who, in an especially cold winter of 1442, used 6 different warmers over the course of a single night. His servants reheated them in the hearth and switched them out as they cooled. That level of luxury was out of reach for the common peasant, but the record underlines how seriously people took the problem of nighttime cold. There were also more dangerous but effective methods. Some bold souls set metal pans or clay pots with smoldering embers right beside the bed. This gave extra warmth and a weak light, but the risks were enormous. Embers could fall out. Smoke might cause carbon monoxide poisoning, or the bedding could catch fire. People resorted to such measures only in extreme cases and with the greatest caution. In some towns, there were even inspectors whose job was to check that people were not using dangerous embers in bed. What a strange resume line that must have made. Medieval bed warmer safety inspector. One more detail. Some peasants heated large stones weighing about 10 to 15 kilograms and placed them under the wooden slats of the bed. The stones radiated heat from below, warming the whole mattress evenly. It was like an underfloor heating system, only medieval. Tests on similar stones show they can stay warm for up to 6 hours. In a few wealthy houses, there were even special niches beneath the floor to hold such stones, and servants would replace them on a schedule every 4 hours. But even with all these tricks, multiple layers of clothing, nightcaps, woolen blankets, sheepskins, hot stones, and warmers, medieval sleep was still an ordeal. By morning, the stones had cooled, the warmers had stopped working, the hearth fire had died down, and the temperature inside the hut often fell nearly to that outside. Peasants frequently woke in the night from cold, shivering beneath all their covers. They had to get up, stoke the fire again, prepare hot food, to warm from the inside. Food, after all, was another essential component of surviving a cold winter. "What you eat warms you," ran the folk wisdom. Medieval peasants knew the truth of it by heart. An empty stomach and cold were a one-way ticket. So the winter ration, especially the last meal before sleep, was planned with care. Which foods gave the most warmth? What did you eat in the evening so you would last until morning? Which drinks warmed best? We will return to those questions in the next section of our story. Remember the old saying, "An empty belly, a cold person." Peasants had learned this not at second hand. You could wrap yourself in 3 woolen cloaks, sleep curled around the dog and pressed up against 5 relatives, but if your stomach was empty, the cold would gnaw down to the bone. The body is a stove that runs on fuel from food. Digestion produces heat, and fats and carbohydrates provide the energy that becomes precious calories. In winter, food was not merely sustenance. It was, in a very literal sense, fuel for the internal stove. Medieval people understood that the heartier the evening meal, the warmer the night would be. The winter diet of a peasant was simple but calorie-rich. At its base was pottage,
that famous pot of porridge and stew. Imagine a large cast-iron cauldron hanging over the hearth, bubbling with a thick, viscous mash. Into it went whatever was at hand: beans, peas, lentils, barley, oats, onions, cabbage, roots. It boiled for hours over a low flame, reducing into a heavy, gluey mass that could be eaten with a spoon or with the hands by scooping it up on a piece of bread. It does not sound appetizing, perhaps, but it was incredibly nourishing and very warming. The main virtue of pottage was its temperature and consistency. A hot, scalding pottage warmed the body from within better than any fireplace could. People ate it slowly, sipping and cooling it with breath, taking pleasure in the way the warmth spread from the gullet down into the stomach. Its thickness meant the stomach stayed full for a long time. Digestion proceeded slowly, releasing heat through the night. It was a natural heater with delayed energy release. If a family was lucky, a piece of meat or a lump of lard was added to the pottage. Fat was medieval winter gold. 1 gram of fat provides 9 kilocalories of energy, roughly twice as much as the same weight of carbohydrates or proteins. A strip of fat bobbing in the hot soup was not merely food, it was medicine for a frozen body. Fat is metabolized slowly, prolongs satiety, and supplies the body with energy for hours ahead. Medieval wisdom advised: the goal of a good diet is to eat as much fat as possible. Modern nutritionists would recoil at the phrase. Yet for people who lived in cold hovels and performed back-breaking labor, this was an entirely sensible strategy. In the autumn before winter, almost every peasant household slaughtered a pig. Pigs were kept by almost everyone because the animals were undemanding, ate virtually anything, and gained weight quickly. The slaughter was a major event, almost a holiday. The meat was salted, smoked, made into sausages and blood pottage. Salted lard and ham were especially prized. They kept through the winter and served as the main source of fat in the diet. A couple of slices of salted ham in a bowl of hot pottage made for a warming and filling supper. Blood sausage, or black pudding, made from pig's blood, fat and grains, was another winter delicacy. It sounds grim, but it was caloric and nourishing, rich in iron and fats. In an age when not a gram of a slaughtered animal could be wasted, using the blood was entirely logical. Nothing went to waste. Intestines became sausage casings, blood went into pudding, bones were simmered for broth, fat was salted, meat smoked. Dairy, cheese, milk, and curd also played an important role in winter nutrition. Cheese was particularly valuable. It concentrated the fats and proteins of milk and kept for a long time. A piece of hard cheese with bread was plain, but very high in calories. Milk in winter was a rare thing, because cows gave less milk in the cold months. When it did exist, people warmed it and drank it hot, sometimes with honey. A warm cup of milk before bed was praised as a calming, warming remedy. Bread was the absolute foundation of every table. Rye, barley, oat, black, coarse, dense loaves that could be sliced only with a very sharp knife. White wheat bread was the privilege of the nobility. Peasants could only dream of it. Yet their rough bread was remarkably filling and nutritious. It was eaten at every meal, dipped into pottage, spread with lard, or eaten plain. Bread, lard, and beer. These were the 3 pillars of the peasant diet. Porridges were respected too. Buckwheat, oatmeal, barley, cooked in water or in milk if it was available. People added honey or butter. Particularly good was a thick porridge with honey before sleep. The honey's sweetness gave a quick surge of energy,
while the slow carbohydrates from the grain provided a lasting sense of fullness. Besides that, a hot porridge physically warmed the stomach and made it easier to fall asleep. And here is something clever in the medieval diet: the theory of hot and cold foods. Medieval medicine, founded on Galen's teaching of the four humors, held that every food had particular qualities. Winter was associated with phlegm, a cold and moist humor. To balance it, one should eat hot and dry foods. Those included mutton, pigeon meat, red wine, butter, figs, cheese, and grapes. People believed these foods literally warmed the body from the inside and counteracted the phlegmatic effects of winter. Of course, poor peasants could not afford mutton and figs every day. That was food for the wealthy. Still, the idea was sound in practice. In winter, you needed calorie-dense, fatty, warming fare. So people took what they could: fatty bacon, thick pottages, caloric porridges. Interestingly, modern science confirms that fatty food does help the body produce more heat and cope with cold more effectively. Now to the drinks, and here the story gets even more interesting. In the Middle Ages, people drank very little water. Why? Because most water sources were unsafe. Wells became contaminated, and river water carried disease. Even the poorest peasants thus preferred beer, and the elites chose wine. Weak alcohol killed many bacteria and was safer than raw water. But in winter, cold beer or wine was not the best choice, so drinks were warmed and spiced. Mulled wine, or medieval hippocras, was wildly popular. The recipe is simple: warm red wine and add cinnamon, ginger, cloves, nutmeg, cardamom, and a little honey or sugar. The spices were costly, so this drink tended to be a luxury, but even modest townsfolk sometimes indulged in a cup of hot spiced wine at a fair. There is even an old recipe from the 10th century in an English cookbook, Form of Curry. It instructs to grind together cinnamon, ginger, cloves, long pepper, nutmeg, marjoram, cardamom, and grains of paradise, then mix this with red wine and sugar. It sounds like a witch's potion, yet the result was magical, warming, invigorating, and even thought to be medicinal. Ordinary people warmed beer with spices as well, what they called buttered beer. No, this is not an invention of modern fiction. It was a real medieval beverage. They heated beer, added spices, and sometimes honey for sweetness, and while it was still hot, they dropped in a piece of butter. The butter melted into the beer, making the drink thick, nourishing, caloric, and remarkably warming. A mug of that before bed put you in good shape for a cold night. Hot cider, alcoholic of course, was also popular. It required neither expensive spices nor sweeteners. Apples grew almost everywhere, and cider was within reach even for the poor. They simply heated it and drank it hot, sometimes adding a stick of cinnamon or a few cloves for aroma. Warm cider, with its light sweetness and tart edge, was an excellent way to warm up and unwind before sleep. There were also non-alcoholic hot drinks, herbal infusions and other boiled brews, chamomile, mint, sage, a decoction of roasted barley or chicory, a sort of primitive coffee. Bone broths were drunk as beverages rather than soups, hot, fatty, concentrated. Even warmed water with lemon and honey was prized where lemons could be had. Everything hot, everything meant to give the body heat from within. One curious drink went by a name like caudle or posset, a warm, eggy brew. Milk was curdled with wine or ale. Eggs, spices, and honey were stirred in, and the result was a thick, nourishing mixture, not unlike what later became known as eggnog. It sounds odd, but people swore by it as the best remedy for winter cold and minor illnesses. By the 15th century, that mixture had evolved into something very like the eggnog we recognize today. Hot drinks were taken not only for comfort, but as medicine. Medieval medical theory held that spices such as cinnamon, ginger, and cloves warmed the blood and drove off phlegm. From our modern vantage, that can sound like superstition, yet the effect has a physiological basis. These spices stimulate circulation, dilate capillaries, and produce a clear sensation of warmth. Ginger, for example, is famed for its warming properties and was used as a cure for colds. So a peasant's evening ritual in winter looked something like this: a solid supper, a hot pottage, greasy bacon, and coarse bread, washed down with a mug of warmed ale or a herbal infusion. A full stomach, heat generated by digestion, the body busy producing internal warmth. Then one wrapped up in woolen blankets, snuggled close to kin, tucked a warmed stone to the feet, and tried to sleep. Despite all these stratagems, proper shelter, a fire in the hearth, shared sleeping, warm clothing, foot wrappings, hot bricks, and a substantial meal, medieval winter remained a brutal test. And do you know the ultimate way peasants dealt with the cold? They simply slept. A lot. Very much. The more you sleep, the less you feel cold, the less you need to eat, the less energy you expend. A human winter slumber was a genuine survival strategy, and it is worth looking at closely. Imagine December outside, a blizzard howling for the third day running, drifts up to the waist, the thermometer reading -20 degrees Celsius. What does a sensible medieval peasant do? Does he heroically rise at dawn and tramp into the fields? Of course not. He does the sensible thing. He stays in bed and keeps sleeping. And he sleeps, and sleeps again. The most effective way to survive cold and scarcity is to minimize activity and spend most of the time asleep. In winter, the rhythms of peasant life slowed so much that from the outside it could look as if time itself had come to a standstill. In summer, peasants rose with the first cocks and worked from dawn to dusk, plowing, sowing, mowing, reaping. But in winter, the fields were frozen through, and the snow came up to the knees. You could, of course, occupy yourself with small repairs, mend a spindle, weave baskets, but the core strategy was blunt: conserve energy. And the best way to conserve energy was to sleep. Studies and contemporary accounts suggest that in especially harsh winters, peasants might sleep 12 to 14 hours a day, or even more. This was not laziness or depression, but a deliberate survival tactic. While asleep, the body uses minimal energy. There is no need to keep the hearth burning all day, no need to consume large quantities of food. Families simply went to bed when darkness fell. In winter, darkness came early, at around 4 to 5 in the evening, and people slept until the morning, often until 8 or 9 o'clock. That could yield as much as 15 to 16 hours of sleep. What might sound incredible is actually documented. In some regions, especially in northern Russia and in France, there existed a true custom of winter semi-hibernation. It sounds almost mythical, yet it is recorded. In the coldest months, January and February, peasants would practically slip into a prolonged sleep, reducing their activity to a minimum and surviving the lean season by letting time and sleep do the work of keeping them alive. The whole family would lie on the stove or on a shared bed and spend most of the day there, rising only to eat once to relieve themselves. The rest of the time was sleep. This is no invention and no exaggeration. Historians have found many attestations of the practice. In one French report of the 15th century, it is said that peasants fall into a kind of torpor like bears and wake only in spring. Russian peasants called the custom the stove bed,
a period when the entire household lay on the heated platform, scarcely moving, passing most of the hours in sleep or half-sleep. It stretched the meager winter stores for months and allowed people to survive the coldest, hungriest part of the year. The physiology is straightforward. When a person sleeps or rests, metabolism slows, body temperature drops slightly, and calorie expenditure falls by several times. If an awake, active adult man expends 2,500 to 3,000 kilocalories a day, a sleeping or motionless person uses only about 1,000 to 1 kilocalories. That is a huge saving when every crumb counts. In effect, medieval peasants applied the same strategy as hibernating animals: reduce activity to make it to spring. Even when full-blown hibernation was not practiced, medieval sleep differed wholly from our modern, continuous 8-hour block. We are used to lying down at 11 o'clock in the evening and rising at 7 in the morning. People before industrialization habitually slept in 2 phases, a pattern scholars call segmented sleep. In the evening, at about 8 or 9 o'clock when dusk fell, the household went to bed for the so-called first sleep, or evening sleep. They slept for 3 or 4 hours, until midnight or a little later, and then woke naturally, not to an alarm, not necessarily from a nightmare, but because their biological clocks simply did so. What did they do when they woke at 1 or 2 in the night? They did many different things. That waking period between first and second sleep went by names: the watch, the night hour, or in French, dormi-veille. It usually lasted an hour or 2, sometimes longer. People might rise to add wood to the hearth, check the animals in the byre, or finish some household task left undone in the evening. Women could feed an infant, sift grain, or patch clothing by the light of embers. More often, it was a time for reflection, prayer, conversation, and even intimacy. Families spoke softly, discussed dreams from the first sleep, dreams that were widely believed to be especially significant. They prayed, appealed to saints, and asked for protection for the remainder of the night. Medical treatises of the period even recommended this interval for conception, arguing that after the first sleep, the body was rested and ready. There are hundreds of historical references to the practice. Historian Roger Ekirch unearthed more than 500 mentions of first and second sleep in diaries, letters, court records, medical treatises, and literature stretching from Homer to the 19th century. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales includes a reference to the first sleep. In Don Quixote, the hero is described as waking after his first sleep. Even Martin Luther wrote in the year 1540, "Each time I wake in the middle of the night, I drive away the unclean spirit, well, let us say, in a rather delicate manner." This pattern of sleeping in 2 phases was universal across the pre-industrial world. In England, in France, in Italy, and in Russia, people commonly slept in 2 stages. The French called the first sleep premier sommeil, and the second the grand matinée. It was regarded as an entirely natural way to sleep. So what changed? Why do we no longer sleep this way? The usual culprit is the Industrial Revolution. With the advent of gas lighting, and later electric lighting at the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century, people stayed up later. Factories operated in shifts and demanded strict timetables. An 8-hour continuous sleep became practical and convenient for industrial schedules. By the beginning of the 20th century, segmented sleep had all but vanished from Western culture, remembered only in passing, and fast becoming a forgotten habit. It is interesting that some modern researchers now think that segmented sleep may in fact be more natural for human beings. Experiments have shown that when people are placed in conditions without artificial light, keeping the day and night rhythms that nature provides, many of them spontaneously move to a 2-phase sleep. Our bodies, perhaps, still remember that older rhythm.
So what have we learned from this journey into a medieval winter night? How did peasants sleep in their huts without freezing? The secret was never a single clever trick, but an entire system of interlinked strategies. First, the right dwelling. Thick walls of wattle and daub or sod, a straw-thatched roof, a sunken floor. Animals housed under the same roof to add their heat to the room. Second, an open hearth with stones that absorbed heat and released it for hours. Third, the art of banking coals, covering them with ash so that embers smoldered through the night. Then there was an insistence on layers in everything. People slept in their clothing, preferably wool. They wore nightcaps and wrapped their feet in cloth. They layered coverings, skins, woolen blankets, old garments, until nothing was wasted. Whole families, and sometimes guests, slept together, forming a human thermal island. Dogs and cats were welcome in the bed as live hot water bottles. Warmed stones, wrapped in rags at the feet, did their work. Pig bladders filled with hot water or metal warming pans with embers served those who could afford them. And food mattered. A heavy evening meal of fatty stew, rendered lard, thick porridge, hot drinks, warmed beer with spices, spiced wine, and herbal decoctions. Anything that warmed from within and provided the fuel for heat production through the night. Most of all, activity was minimized in winter. Long sleeps, sometimes lasting 14 to 16 hours a day, even approaching near hibernation in extreme cases, were part of the calendar. This was wisdom accumulated by generations of trial and error. Parents taught children how to survive conditions that now feel intolerable to many urban dwellers. When you lie tonight in your warm bed, in a heated flat under a down duvet, perhaps with an electric blanket at hand, remember those who slept on straw, in smoke, dressed, pressed close to 7 relatives and 2 dogs, with a warmed stone at their feet. They were not miserable or primitive. They were inventive, resilient, and wise. They knew what we have largely forgotten: how to work with nature rather than against it, how to apply simple physical principles to survive, how to value warmth, food, family, and sleep. Many of their methods still work. Layered clothing, the thermal mass of stones, straw insulation, and communal sleeping for warmth remain practical solutions used today by hikers, survivalists, and people in extreme conditions. So the next time you complain that a room is chilly, that your blanket is not warm enough, that the radiators are weak, think of a medieval peasant in his soot-streaked hut, with a jug of icy water at the bedside and a warm stone at his feet. Modern inconveniences will suddenly seem less severe. Better yet, try some of those old measures. A nightcap really does conserve heat. A warmed foot wrap works wonders, and a bowl of hot porridge with honey before bed comforts both body and soul. Human ingenuity in the struggle against cold has come a long way. From ash-banked coals to central heating, from stones in cloth to electric blankets, from communal sleeping for warmth to private bedrooms with thermostats. But at the core, the principles remain the same: insulation, heat retention, and using available resources. Medieval peasants did not know the formal laws of thermodynamics, but they knew how to survive. That accumulated knowledge helped people endure the Little Ice Age and live to see an era when heat comes at the flip of a switch. Good night, and may your sleep be warm in memory of those who fought for every degree of warmth on a bitter winter night. With you was Daniel Hayes. See you in the next episode of Lectures Under the Moon. If you enjoyed this, please like and subscribe.